here this evening, and that those of you who are here too. And I'm going to ask her to sign my book before she begins telling us about how she went on this journey to produce this.
So I had to learn which page you're supposed to do this on. Here, actually I've signed it.
I was looking in the inside.
I think I did it on the wrong page for that one.
Thank you.
I had to learn, so thank you. So, the title, so I did before the title page. So one of the titles and not the other title. It's very, I did bring a copy just for people to take a peek at, mainly because the press did a really nice job of the cover and actually the whole production of the book, which isn't always true these days because presses are under so much stress. So I was extraordinarily pleased and with the, after all that work, if it doesn't look good aesthetically, it's kind of depressing. So anyway.
And there are pathology images in the
Yes, right. So you should appreciate the aesthetics. It really mattered to me, ironically. So first of all, I just want to thank Aggie both for inviting me to talk to you today about the book and, to be honest, for her extraordinary support over the years as I did a project where the gratification or the outcome or the metric, if you will, was extremely delayed. And books don't just, well, who knows if it's good or not, but books don't just get produced overnight. And in fact, this represents at least a decade of work. But again, also thank you for coming out at the end of a long and hard day. I've kept the shades up in the back because I figure, too much dark might be better. I'll flip back and forth when we actually need to look more carefully at the picture. But what I'm going to do is just give a 30-minute talk this evening, just highlighting a few points. One, how I came to write this book in the first place, what questions about how we produce knowledge and what knowledge we actually produce get raised, and then why I turn to historical evidence to better understand what at first glance might seem like strictly a scientific problem. I'll feature just a few of my main findings and then open it up to discussion. I became interested in the topic of race. Can you read this, or should I turn the lights? Turn the lights? Okay. Let me try. Okay. So if I see you all nodding off, I'll start to flip it back. So I became interested in the topic of race and lung function when I read an article in the Providence Journal in the good old days when, you can see the date on here, when one sat down in the morning and read real newspapers. I miss it, but now I do it online the night before in general. But at any rate, I was richly rewarded for paying attention to the news in this particular case. The defendant in a large asbestos case, Owens Corning, which is a manufacturer of asbestos insulation, was embroiled in litigation, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. And in this particular point raised the idea of race correction for black plaintiffs in the case. So what Owens Corning argued was that because blacks consistently scored lower on tests for lung function, they should apply race correction before the workers could move from the inactive to the active docket. In other words, before they were entitled to compensation. This raised a bit of an issue. It went through the courts for a while. Ultimately, the judge did not rule in their favor. But essentially what it would have meant is that black former asbestos workers suffering from asbestos-related diseases had to show more loss of lung function than white workers. This particular article was syndicated from the Baltimore Sun. There was a lot more detail in the Sun article. But it caught my eye because I was participating in a race workshop at MIT on race and medicine. And what we were trying to do in this workshop was not just document disparities, which, even by that time, people pretty much knew that they were extreme and problematic. But we were trying to look at the history of the concept of race and the role of science in producing and sustaining the idea of race and racial difference. So in that context, I found this article quite intriguing. I began consulting pulmonologists, including my good friend David Kern, who used to be here, an occupational health physician, and I learned quickly that the consensus view in pulmonary medicine was indeed that blacks and whites differed in the capacity and functioning of their lungs. And importantly, what many pulmonologists thought and had been taught in medical school was that this difference was innate. The explanation given to me in interviews with physicians was that the difference was probably due to trunk length, but really nobody quite knew what. I also learned that spirometry was of critical importance in compensation cases. In fact, in many circumstances, it could be the defining criteria for compensation, and this is the case in a large asbestos case in South Africa. There are two methods of what is really called race correction. One is proportional adjustment, which a scaling factor is applied to white standards. So the standard of normal is based on population studies in whites. And then if a black patient comes in, a scaling factor is applied to that patient. And then the second way of correcting for race is using population-specific standards. And this is what is favored now. The scaling factor, many people were uncomfortable with, and for interesting reasons, people are more comfortable with the population-specific standards. But it's when they're using population-specific standards, it's uneven. So this is the guidance statement from the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, and they use population-specific standards for blacks, but scaling factors for Asians and Asian Americans. The instruments, most of you should be familiar with spirometers. I'm sure you use them and probably race corrected at some point in your clinical training. The instruments vary a lot, and let me see this. So here's an old one, and here race correction had to be done manually. The new machines, this is one in a primary care physician's office. This is a spirometer from South Africa in the printout. The point I want to make is that in the more modern machines, the correction factors or the population standards, whichever, are actually programmed into the machine. So in general, and this came out in interviews, the operators don't necessarily know what standards are actually in the machine. They vary quite a bit, although they're tending towards using NHANES now. That has, certainly has its own issues. But many people did not know they were correcting for race when they pushed this button. We're sort of so used to just collecting race as a demographic variable that many people didn't know that they were actually correcting. I want to make one point before going on, and that is that if one is ascribing difference to innateness, then one has to be able to make the case that blacks as a group are homogeneous genetically, and that whites as a group are homogeneous genetically. And I'll talk a little bit more as we go on. As I thought more about this article and just David Kern gave me a whole bunch of articles to look at, several questions emerged that guided my research. And I should just say I'm tremendously grateful to David for being really my interlocutor throughout this project, throughout the scientific paper and the book. So some of the questions that were raised: do blacks as a group have lower lung function than whites as a group? If so, why? So the why question often gets just skirted over. Are these two groups then biologically / genetically homogeneous? Have they been treated as homogeneous in the scientific literature? And this I actually did a study to look at, a sort of side study from the book. What the main focus of the book really is: how did the idea of difference originate? Where did it come from? And then this is a relationship that only emerged as I got really quite deep into the literature. I really had conceptualized it in a much kind of flatter and less nuanced way. But what was actually the relationship between the idea of difference and the history of technological innovation with the spirometer? I quickly, as I began to do some research, though, it became clear to me that I needed a multi-pronged approach, that just looking at this through the lens of science wasn't going to answer many of the questions that I wanted to, that I felt needed to be answered in order to fully understand this practice of race correction. And so I undertook a scientific study using the methodology of the systematic review, which I don't know if anybody's ever done it, but it's incredibly onerous. It yielded very, very interesting data, but it was a real challenge, although I'm doing another one. So I thought I had learned my lesson, and I clearly haven't. In part, I'm really intrigued by approaching these questions in a very systematic way, and I think that's my scientific background coming into it. But I also realized that I had to do some serious historical work, and I'm not trained as a historian, so I actually had to get myself trained. I was fortunate to be able to do a fellowship in history of science at Harvard's history of science department with funding from the NSF. That was hugely helpful in professionalizing. But I literally read and read and read because I had to immerse myself in all, not just learning what, history in this very chronological way, but what were all the historiographic debates. And my work spanned the US, South Africa, and Britain, and so I actually had to learn the history of all those three countries. So I have to say it was a lot of fun. Let me first just talk briefly about the scientific analysis that I did to just give you a flavor of what's out there in the science, and then I'll shift to the historical work. So in collaboration with Kay Dickerson, who used to be here in public health, she's an expert systematic reviewer, and then a former student, Melanie Wolfgang, who really hung in there. I conducted a systematic review of 226 papers through PubMed search and then manual search for anything that wasn't in PubMed. And it spanned the years 1922 to 2008, and selection criteria was, there were several different criteria, but the most important for right now is that the paper had to compare a group to whites. So, and the groups came from all over the world, 94 different groups. This slide gives a brief summary of the kinds of claims that are in the scientific literature. So what you can see if you just look at the green bar is that the vast majority of the studies from the 1920s to 2000 found that every other group in the world had lower lung capacity than whites. And this is, truly across the world. It's a global, this type of research was a global phenomenon, really from the 1920s, and I'll just mention that briefly. The hierarchy that everybody in the world is lower than whites, should sort of give us, it should have given pause to people a little bit earlier, it seems to me. But what I was particularly interested in is how is this difference explained? So you could imagine that less privileged people, whatever their race, ethnicity, would have, that their lung function would be affected by exposures to chemicals, where they live, et cetera. And so there could be some kind of differences that fell along racial lines, but that didn't have anything to do with an innate biological difference. This slide summarizes what we coded as mentions of explanations for difference. And so we looked at inherent difference and the kinds of what got coded in inherent were things like genetics. Earlier in the century, people just referred to a racial factor, and I'll show you that in just a second. Then anthropometric difference, body dimensions is where the trunk length is. In fact, those two are pretty intertwined, but I separated them out because it's possible that you could imagine anthropometry is changing, and in fact it does. But for the most part, when people invoked anthropometric difference, they meant an innate difference. And then environmental and social factors were sometimes, well, not infrequently, a part of the narrative, mechanical, technical. What's interesting, and particularly in the 2000s, is no explanation was quite common. So, you know, you could argue that the no explanation might imply that people felt that there wasn't any explanation needed, that it was so commonsensical. What I want to point out here is that these kinds of explanations were put forth even while race, the central variable, was not defined. So we looked at the methods section for all the papers and looked at how they defined race, and I believe it's 83% of the papers did not define race or ethnicity. And even in the 2000s, where it's the definitions, the proportion defining is a little higher, actually we gave credit for anything. And it was really quite variable how people define. So there's no real systematic approach to it. So this does raise the question about what kind of basis this idea is, what kind of science is actually behind this idea that races differ in the capacity of their lungs. I think one important point to note in looking at this literature is that there's a very, very small literature in social class. And social class sort of seems like a no-brainer because many of the environmental factors that could affect people along racial lines can also affect people along class lines. And in fact, this is obviously quite important in occupational health, where working class people are exposed to more hazardous substances more at higher rates than non-working class people. But the social class is not a part of this literature. So what became interesting to me then was, what is the history of this practice? Why was it taken so for granted? Let me just see if I can turn the lights up for a few minutes. Why was this idea so taken for granted? And where did it come from? And my project started out what I thought was just going to be an article. And then in history, articles are very long. So it was a 30-page article, and I thought, wow, if I can write a 30-page article, maybe I could do a book. And just the more and more, as I wrote the article, more and more dimensions of the problem presented itself. And so I started really tracking the spirometer as it intersected with race through all these different fields that are shown on this slide: life insurance, medicine, physiology research, disability, statistics, anthropometry, and physical education. That is something I never ever thought I would have to immerse myself in, but I ended up spending probably about a year studying the history of physical education. And that is actually quite interesting because I was tracking this history as it intersected with societal debates in the US, South Africa, and Britain. And there were knowledge exchanges going on this practice. And some of those societal debates were debates about emancipation in the US. Some were about national efficiency, which was a big deal in Britain at the turn of the century. Race degeneration, again in Britain. Physical fitness, and deeply, deeply about human worth. So these are societal debates that lung capacity was actually marshaled and in some ways attempted to adjudicate. Let me just briefly tell you where the evidence for this came from. So the evidence for this work came from archival materials, which is what historians do. And that I found, I think maybe all those years in labs, I actually loved archival work. And some people, my husband's actually was a history major in college and hates archival work. So it really is a temperamental thing. But I would just go into the archives and you would have to drag me out at the end of the day. And I did archival work at 3 countries, South Africa, Britain, and the US. I also looked at extensively and intensively at scientific literature, conference papers, minutes, oral histories. I did a lot of reading on the history of US, South Africa, Britain, and then history of technology. What I found is that the spirometer moved among many different social worlds, all the while becoming more and more deeply enmeshed in matters of race. So the overarching question of my book is, what are the social and scientific processes by which the idea that the lungs of blacks and whites differed? And what assumptions then or biases, what kinds of assumptions then informed this research? I began my research in mid-19th century Britain, where the spirometer, which had been actually being used and developed in a variety of different ways for centuries, was first used in large populations by British physician John Hutchinson. And Hutchinson is usually cited in many articles on the spirometer. He built an elegant machine and adapted it to use in large-scale studies. I mean, they were 4,000 people. Those are large studies, even by today's standards. Hutchinson's work drove a flurry of innovation throughout the 19th century in both Europe, across the continent, and the US. And it's in the US that it got racialized, and quite quickly and for quite interesting reasons. The point, though, is that even at that time, technological innovations traveled very, very quickly. So what's interesting to read in the scientific papers is some of the little short notes, and you'll find people finding out something about what the spirometer and quickly wanting to make one and play with it and use it. So these technological innovations traveled fast. By the early 1850s, knowledge about the spirometer had traveled across the Atlantic to the US, both the US North and South, where physicians started experimenting with it. In the South, a major innovator was the pro-slavery plantation physician Samuel Cartwright, who used a spirometer that he built to compare lung capacity in blacks and whites. Educated at Penn Med School, Cartwright was a forward-thinking scientist with technological interests. In fact, as an early adopter of the spirometer in the US, Cartwright was considered by his peers an important scientific pioneer. Whereas Hutchinson had organized his measurements according to occupation, and this is a whole chapter in the book, categories that were culturally resonant in a rapidly industrializing Britain at the time, Cartwright used race. Cartwright reported that the lung capacity of slaves was lower than whites, and from what I can tell, it was for the very first time he quantified this deficit precisely, emphasizing functional difference, which he tied to labor needs, which you can imagine what they were. He claimed that the deficiency in the Negro was 20%. Lest we think that the idea of difference is simply a product of the backward antebellum South, Cartwright was in fact in good company. In fact, he drew on the interpretive framework of Thomas Jefferson, who in his notes on the state of Virginia, published in the late 18th century, posited many physical distinctions between slaves and whites, including a difference in structure in the pulmonary apparatus. In Jefferson's hands, thus, the pulmonary apparatus, or the lungs, was but one defining characteristic of slaves that made them unfit for freedom and citizenship and suited to agricultural labor. So there are 2 points here. Classification was important to spirometric measurement from its earliest years. That's not dissimilar from many of the dilemmas we face with generating lots of data and finding ways to classify it. and that spirometry has long been racialized. And in fact, the idea of difference dates to the early years of the slave-owning American Republic. After Cartwright, lung capacity research shifted to the northern U.S. when the esteemed astronomer Benjamin Apthorpe Gould was charged by the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War to organize a large anthropometric study of Union soldiers. This is a huge, huge study. Interesting, and it's published in a 600-page book with, I can't remember the number of tables, but it's tons and tons of tables. Really a lot of work went into this, both in the collection of the data and then in trying to figure out how to organize the data. And I get at how some of the messiness was smoothed over as the data was, I guess the language now is cleaned up, but this has always been done. Gould devoted an entire chapter to lung capacity, and there's no papers that I've been able to find of Gould to say why they decided to devote this chapter. One thing, though, is they were fascinated by the instrument. So this was a time of a lot of interest in precision instruments. And this particular instrument was used throughout the field at the end of the Civil War. What happened is that blacks were allowed into the Union Army at the end of the Civil War, and so there was just this kind of laboratory for comparing blacks and whites that was presented to Gould and the Sanitary Commission more broadly. Now, with Gould, there's no explanation given for difference. He just let kind of the facts speak for themselves, and this is a table from that chapter. But these facts really did take on a life of their own. Gould is cited in the contemporary literature and as evidence for difference. But even more important in terms of how the idea of racial difference gained credibility and got entrenched in the scientific literature is that Gould's research caught the attention of Charles Darwin, who included lung capacity along with craniometry as indicators of racial difference in descent of man and selection race in relation to sex. As you probably all know, craniometry has been a site of very contentious arguments over many, many years. Interesting, though, the lung capacity never was part of those arguments. Well, it was in two different cases, and I'll tell you about that. But obviously, once Darwin takes up something like this, it becomes more important. So Gould's ostensibly neutral scientific data was marshaled after Darwin to adjudicate really quite contentious societal debates over emancipation at the end of the 19th century in much more explicitly racist ways. So, well, actually, Cartwright, if you read Cartwright, you can hardly stomach it. So it kind of moves between these kind of explicit racist expressions and then becomes very implicit. And some clearly think that when there's not an explanation there, that the racial assumptions have gone. But that's sort of what I've tried to analyze in the book. A really important figure in this whole discussion is Frederick Hoffman, who in 1896 wrote the book Race Traits and Tendencies of the American Negro. It can only be described as a vicious racist diatribe. Here, Hoffman was very, very important to occupational health, actually. He was a leader in the field. Alice, what's her name, Hamilton, talked about him as a voice in the wilderness. He was chief statistician for Prudential for 40 years. So he had an influence in, certainly in blacks' access to insurance over that period. But he made very broad claims. He devoted a whole chapter of his book to lung capacity too, in which he basically took the data from Gould and used it in an entirely different way. And Hoffman said that the smaller lung capacity of the colored race is itself proof of an inferior physical organism, and this assertion is proved by the greater mortality of the races compared to the white. What he was arguing, and what other intellectuals at the time were arguing, is that blacks were going to die out because they were so physically inferior and that they couldn't survive off plantations without white owners. Now, there was also another narrative that they were going to take over. So, there were these two things kind of going on at the same time. Interestingly, there were dissenting views at this time. So when Hoffman's work invited an immediate response from W.E.B. Du Bois and Kelly Miller, who was the first African-American PhD in the country. And both Du Bois integrated his work into a lot of his writings, and then Kelly Miller wrote this wonderful, wonderful pamphlet that's a trenchant critique of Hoffman's argument. But nonetheless, and I think this was illustrative of a sort of disconnect emerging between social sciences and science, the Du Bois and Miller's critiques failed to alter the trajectory of scientific discourse on the meaning of lung capacity measurements. Only Gould, not Hoffman or Cartwright's more strident narratives would be cited in future scientific literature. So in the 1920s, U.S., at a moment when scientific medicine was ascended, and this was right after the Flexner Report that, as you all know, resulted in the closing of most female and black medical schools in the country. And eugenic policies rooted in hereditarianism were popular. There was a flurry of scientific articles published in the U.S. on racial difference. And then they moved to China and India, where there was further support for this idea. Difference was by and large explained as innate. And one example of an explanation is this paper published in 1922 in JAMA that speculated that difference could be due to a possible racial factor. I also want to note here that they collected data on so-called colored children, but they didn't include them in the normals. So black children were not part of the normals. So this is also an interesting phenomenon that I haven't fully explored. There was one notable difference in the explanatory frameworks in the 1920s, and this was by physical educator Charles McCoy. He was a missionary in China and a physician, and he found that whites and Chinese were similar except for exercise. So there, his view from physical education that was predicated on physical exercise being able to change, he came out with something different. He published it in Annals of Internal Medicine, but his work disappeared, and I think the last I looked, its last citing was in the 1930s. So a paper that worked against the growing dominant narrative just dropped out of the literature. By 1925, the evidence of racial difference was considered sufficiently strong to be included as fact in a much cited and widely used handbook for clinicians. The main point is by the end of the 1920s, the dominant frame was set. And that frame would just kind of get built on itself. Not much happened in this area of research until the 1960s. So there's a long period, except actually it's not much happened in the US, but the studies in the 30s and 40s were in China and India. And at a certain point, some of the articles are in English, and I was able to look at them, and then some are in Chinese. So, and actually, in the Indian articles come out with different explanatory frameworks, emphasizing environment more. Not completely, but it wasn't as set as in the U.S. The majority of the studies came from the U.S., the 1960s being the point at which this literature just burgeoned. What's interesting to think about is, in some ways, why the U.S. is so important, is that the U.S. and then South Africa had two populations of people considered racially distinct, so they kind of had a natural laboratory for controlled studies, which are obviously, the gold standard of well-designed studies. So the US and South African studies get cited, or the US cited the most. Explanations for difference began to get more complicated, moving beyond a racial factor to include a wide range of factors, but the basic explanatory framework stayed quite similar. The point is that through the 60s, through the 70s, and into the 80s, there was no contestation. But the contestation that did come was, in some sense, important for us to think about why it came from there, and it came from South Africa. And I've looked at this literature pretty carefully, so I think that Johnny Myers and Neil White and others in South Africa who were active in the anti-apartheid struggle were the first researchers to interrupt the dominant frame since Du Bois and Kelly Miller. And they were doing this at an incredibly contentious moment. It was volatile, a bloody 1980s states of emergency, and they practiced they questioned the practice of race correction, with Myers taking the radical step of proposing a universal standard for all. Created quite a flurry of interest in South Africa, but because they were published in South African papers, they were rarely cited out of the out of South Africa. And when they were, their main points were not those that were cited. So to close, where are we now? As this New England Journal of Medicine paper, you probably can't, this is worth, actually. As this New England Journal of Medicine paper illustrates, newer genomic technologies such as ancestry informative markers simply build on rather than challenge the race-based model. And interestingly and importantly, one is a pulmonologist and one is a geneticist, cite the 19th century Gould paper that was not corrected for height or age. So it's really kind of surprising to me that they didn't, that they cited this completely uncritically. The point is that over this long history, race is the almost exclusive lens through the rich and huge variability in lung function has been studied. So in tracking the history of the spirometer and its racialization over time, I've argued that science, including the questions we ask, the methods we use, the arguments we make, is shaped profoundly by the social context. And I haven't fully developed that argument here in 30 minutes, but the book attempts to do that in probably not in detail that might get tiresome. I shouldn't say that about my book. I really want you to all go out and buy my book. Anyway, the point is that this is a practice that continues into the present, and nobody can believe that except physicians, are doing it. But I think many aren't totally aware of it, and many people are actually uncomfortable with the practice. But the point is that it's harder to see what we're doing in the present because it's all so normal. And I think there's two areas of concern that really are somewhat separate but interrelated. Examining lung function measurements through the lens of race not only produces and reifies race as a genetically circumscribed category, but it also obscures the social and structural dimensions of respiratory health and disease. And I really love this book, and it's hard to get through, but his insights are so profound. Michel Rolf Trouillot, a Haitian anthropologist and historian, tells us that we're never so steeped in the past as when we pretend not to be. And my book really is an attempt to explore how the past actually lives in the present in current spirometry research. And maybe by identifying these processes by which the past is sustained and reproduced, we can open new questions, because we won't get answers to questions we don't ask in the first place. So thank you very much for sitting here so patiently at 6:30 on a. So, any questions?
So I'm sure Buddy would be happy to answer any questions, publicly or privately.
Besides spirometry, what other types of clinical measurements incorporate these corrections?
Yeah, so actually the answer to that question's changed since I undertook the research. So there's growth curves. There's a history around growth curves, but glomerular filtration rate is now being race corrected. And I actually had I taught an elective in the med school this year on this, and a couple of the med students began to look at that process of how it doesn't have quite the history. I think in fact it may be that this practice is sort of morphing or shaping. Well, if it's true for lung function, it might be a way to explain glomerular filtration rate. So that's a really interesting area of research that I just haven't had time to get into in more detail. I mean, I do think, fortunately I have a daughter who's a primary care physician, so I keep playing these things off of her. I think the clinic is becoming very, very racialized right now. And ironically, this is a response to activism and advocacy to try to get more attention to racial disparities in disease. But if you look at the single factor that affects health the most across races, it's segregation. And so in some ways we're looking in all these scientific areas when the solution to the problem is not a scientific one. And in fact, it's kind of leading us down another path that's reinforcing ideas of difference that when you push most people, the idea that health disparities are primarily social is pretty easily understood. I mean, that is what people believe, but somehow this enterprise is So I'm interested, obviously, in the whole genetics debate and race, but this particular book didn't deal with that directly, although what you see towards the end with the research is it's getting geneticized much more.
Yeah, one lab value that figures this way is absolute neutrophil count.
Is what?
Absolute neutrophil count.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that.
Which is supposed to be lower in blacks and may serve to help them in that a borderline low neutrophil count in a black is considered a little less worrisome, and so they may be not subjected to unnecessary invasive workup because of that.
Yeah, so and I think maybe hemoglobin too. There's just I've heard of. I haven't looked at the data for neutrophil, but so that's an interesting question. Is what's it based on? The key thing is when you're applying these standards, you have to know what's black and what's not black, and what's and the whole literature on lung function is. I've gone through and counted what it mostly looks at, and it's black-white difference. And as you look at the history, that makes more sense. But I actually did some interviews with people about how do you determine the person's race. And people say, oh, well, I eyeball it. People aren't particularly comfortable in asking what your race is when you're having a lung function test. You know, a lot of people might say, why do you want to know my race? What does that have to do with lung function? When it does come up, they get the standard. So I should look into that literature.
Most of the studies, how much black is considered black?
Well, there is, so that's something that genetics is working on, percentages of what is. There are no black genes. So any kinds of differences. So what's interesting about this is the whole project is a project of trying to simplify an approach to understanding human variability. So variability in lung function is huge. And there's no question but that humans vary in lots of different ways, including genetics. Are the classification systems that we have in place, do those capture human variability? So the slide, I don't have it, but what I use a lot in teaching is a history of the US Census. And the racial categories in the US Census have changed every single decade since 1790. So if the racial categories are changing every decade, we have to ask that question, what is race? And treating blacks as a homogeneous group, and so far there is no gene that is absolutely specific to any one racial group. It's you get these circles of probabilities where there's, and in fact, when a lot of people talk about this, they say, well, you know, South Africa is messy, we can't do South Africa. East Africa is messy, North Africa is excluded from Africa. So whenever they talk about Africa, it's not North Africa. Now, as far as I know, North Africa is part of that continent. And in fact, when you look historically, there's been lots and lots of movement across the Saharan desert. So those, what we consider as barriers, were not the barriers that they're thought of. Asia is, you know, a tremendously diverse continent. You know, what about the Middle East? So the question really is, how do you classify people, and are you really capturing anything helpful in those classifications? The census categories are political categories, period. And there's been really great literature showing the role of science in actually changing those categories at different historical moments. Right now, we're much more used to the actual activism around, so Hispanic, that category appeared in 1980. Before that, Mexicans were always considered white. So these things have changed. They change over time in response to social context. And if we start using if we start trying to map genes onto them, we're going to run into a lot of trouble.
So what your comments that you just made are relevant to my filling out the planned enrollment table for an NIH grant application today, because they just changed the format. So it used to be that there was a table for ethnic, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, and there's a separate table for racial categorization. And now that's combined into one table, and along one side is ethnic, and along the other side is racial. And there are 28 boxes that you have to distribute people into in that form. And what are your thoughts on the NIH asking us to do that?
Well, you know, so that happened NIH first mandated the use of race and ethnicity in response to activism. There's a whole book written on that. Stephen Epstein's, I do have this. This is just a sample of the books that are written on this topic that scientists don't read. So they're written by historians and social scientists. So, I mean, one of the things I'm actually really interested in is the disconnect between, so Stephen Epstein's inclusion really helps, analyzes that whole problem. It's probably going to be a lot of work for nothing. What often happens, at least at the state level, so at the state levels there's more categories and they get recombined into the racial groups, into the main racial groups. There's a lot of discussion going on right now about the next US Census and what should be used. But you know, the fact is, no matter how, it depends what you're using it for. So I'm not against the use of race or ethnicity if you're trying to monitor disadvantage in some sort of way, or the the biological expression of the experience of racism. And there's been a lot of work on this, looking at hypertension. And so what is the experience of living with racism in hypertension? And that's not a genetic argument, it's about a social experience argument that has a biological consequence. But you're always faced with the idea that humans are mixed. Humans have been interacting and mixing from, although Nicholas Wade, the science writer for the Times, has a book coming out where he says we were separate for a long time and then just recently started to mix. That's a really scary, that's sort of we're back to 19th century racism with that book.
Two
It'll
of the
be real.
racial categories are multiple and other.
Well, and Latinos tend to check other. So they do not identify with the category as a group. Now, Latinos, hugely complex. But I think one problem is we tend to look at it and say, oh, yeah, Latinos are really complex. They're from Dominican Republic. They're from here, there. But blacks got homogenized through the process of slavery, and the blacks in the U.S. are from a very rich complexity of ethnic groups. But the point is that even ethnic groups are not distinct. They have been interacting. So I have another kind of area that looks at that. So it would be, I think the challenge, I actually had some of the med students in the elective read some of these books. And it was really fabulous elective, and it was helpful to see how they made sense of the social science in the context. I had second years and fourth years, so people who've been through the clinics and people who were just in the base, just through the first 2 years. And they looked at it really very differently. Obviously, many of them have been exposed to these ideas. Medical anthropology students, pre-med students are taking these courses. Culture and Health here is a really popular course. So they're coming to med school with these ideas. Personally, I think there should be more faculty discussion around this, around papers, because I think in some ways faculty are getting set up with the students coming to the lectures, having had other exposure to other perspectives, and the faculty, a lot of this just changed even in the course of, while I was doing this, the whole, this decade, everything's changed. So I think we need more considerations of the nuances.
When you were teaching these medical students, our medical students themselves are incredibly diverse. Did the diversity among the students, is that apparent how they reacted to some of these things?
Well, one of the things that makes teaching this fun is that the ideas about races being genetic categories doesn't break down along racial lines. So you can have really great discussions in classrooms where people aren't so terrified about talking about race, because the ideas you would never be able to predict by looking at a student what kinds of orientations they would have to this literature. So the discussions are pretty good. I had students who were students of color who said, oh, I don't see any racism in the clinic. And then we started reading more about what actually happens and trying to think not so much in terms of intentional racism, but more in terms of assumptions about race that inform how we see the world, that everybody has assumptions about other races. Nobody doesn't have assumptions. The question is, how do you make those assumptions explicit and begin to think about how they influence what you do? So I've always found that thinking in terms of assumptions, that it's not such a charged way, and people aren't afraid of being called racist, which is what does make people scared in classrooms. More so, probably less so in undergrad. By the time you're in med school, I think it's a little harder. But it was pretty interesting experience, and then the ways. I mean, one group, the group of the two students of color who didn't think there was racism in the clinic, actually then came up with these wonderful examples of diet, how the diet schemes exclude, that how normative they are based on what's a healthy diet that is, very much a Western kind of diet. So, and how you could even hold on to that is every New York Times has a new, now saturated fat says fine. So, but we started to see things in the clinics that I wasn't aware of, and they weren't aware of initially. So thank you very much, and thank you for your questions. Thanks a lot.